Okay. And let me start also with the presentation, of course. A very warm welcome to begin with to all the participants to this last installment of our series entitled Environment, Societies and Histories in East Asia. Today we'll conclude actually our journey through mostly, the environmental histories of China and Japan, and I'm very happy to do it with our distinguished guest today, Professor David Fedman from University of California, Irvine. It's very, again, as yesterday with Jacobina Arch, it is very early in the morning in the United States, West Coast. So thanks again, David, for joining us today. And of course, thank you to all the people who decided to, spend some time with us today in this Zoom lecture, this online lecture that is going to start in a few minutes. So I would, as always, like to thank the co-organizer of this lecture series, who I'm seeing online, Maddalena. Thank you very much for your work. And
hi, Marco.
Hi. And for actually taking these topics and taking environmental history in East Asia to heart and deciding to organize such an interesting and insightful series up to now. We hope, of course, to create a small legacy in this, and to hope to continue doing that. Of course, I would also like to thank, before giving the floor to David, I would also like to thank the new Institute Center for Environmental Humanities, or NICH. Also, on behalf of Professor Francesca Tarocco, who is chairing the Institute, I would like to thank again David Fedman, and of course welcoming you, though virtually, in Venice. As a matter of fact, we're looking very much forward to welcoming you maybe one day physically in our university. So I think I already spent too much time, thanking people and with the welcome stuff. But let's turn to today's topic, and let's turn to the introduction of our guests. Again, David Fedman is associate professor in history at the School of Humanities of the University of California, Irvine. His research focuses on mostly Japan and Korea's environmental histories, especially. Today, his talk will be based on his latest publication, Seat of Control, its latest book, at least, Seat of Control, which is a very insightful, a very well-researched study on, let's call it like this, green imperialism, Japanese green imperialism in Korea in the first half of the 20th century. I would say no more, because I would otherwise spoil David's presentation. So David, whenever you're ready. Oh, again, one organizational note. As those of you who were there yesterday with Jacobina Arch might remember, we have first a presentation by our guest, and then a discussion session, which is led by a colleague from the Department of Environmental Science, Professor Renata Soukand, who is online and will start off with her question and her discussion to today's topic and to David's book. So without further ado, I think I said everything. Maddalena, please correct me if I'm wrong or chime in if I forgot about something. I don't hear anything. Okay, green lights. So without further ado, I would leave the floor to David Fedman. Thanks again for joining us today, David. The floor is yours.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for the kind introduction, for the invitation to share my research, to be a part of such a distinguished series of speakers. I'm going to start with a warning that not only is it early, it's breakfast time in the Fedman household right now, and my wife is currently severely outnumbered, which means there's high chances of drama downstairs that it might make its way into the soundtrack a little bit of my presentation today. So apologies in advance if that's the case. I would much rather have a conversation with you all than give a full-fledged research presentation on the book. So I'm going to try to keep my remarks relatively short. What I'm going to do is introduce to you all what I consider to be the four main arguments and interventions that run through the book, with the hopes that might pique your curiosity a little bit, but also prompt some questions from you all. I'm very much looking forward to my conversation with Renata, but I also do invite you all to come forward with any questions or comments of your own. I'm now going to share my slides. And as Marco said, I'm going to be presenting research from my first book, Seeds of Control, Japan's Empire of Forestry in Colonial Korea. And I think you're absolutely right, Marco, to describe it as a study of Japan's green imperialism in Korea and beyond. So at one level, the book can be read as my attempt to think and look beyond the green archipelago. The origins of this project stretch back to the year I spent right out of my undergrad, when I had an opportunity I was put on a fellowship to research the history of mountaineering and alpinism in Japan. And it was in that context, when I had this really amazing opportunity to just spend a year in the mountains and forests of Japan, that I was exposed to a almost relentless stream of commentary about Japan's national forest culture, supposedly timeless traditions of forest stewardship and conservation that stretched back into deep antiquity, that was manifest in both the dense forests that blanket the archipelago today, but also traditions of wooden handicraft manufacture and cherry blossom viewing and reverence. And this always struck me as problematic on a number of levels. It is for one thing, culturally essentialist, obscuring the incredible variety and diversity of forestry traditions at the local level across Japan. It also was at odds with my understanding of the role that Japan and its corporate proxies had played in the deforestation of landscapes abroad, beyond the archipelago. Historically, Japan has played an outsized role in the control and management of forests across the Asia Pacific, be it as part of the colonial empire up until 1945, with the expansion into places like Taiwan, Karafuto, Korea, Manchuria, and beyond, or in the post-war period in the tropical forests of Southeast Asia, where to the very present day, Japanese corporations are overseeing massive forestry operations, many of them tied to clear-cutting operations, palm oil plantations, among other things. So part of what I'm trying to do with this project is to map out kind of the full scope, the full imprint of Japan's environmental reach and forestry traditions, to look beyond national frameworks. I argue in the book that one cannot understand the verdancy of the Japanese landscape at home without looking to its control of forests beyond the archipelago. And in doing this, one of the things I'm trying to do is rethink the very concept of the green archipelago. Some of you are perhaps familiar with Conrad Totman's book by that very name. While in the mountains, I had had ample time to read his book, The Green Archipelago, which is really a pioneering work of Japanese environmental history. It charts out the growth and evolution of Japan's own traditions of silviculture, of regenerative forestry, showing how across the Tokugawa period, across the early modern Japan's history, the state had and different stakeholders had a vested interest in sustainable forestry practices that evolved independent to those of Germany, long considered sort of the cradle of scientific and sustainable forestry practices. It's a fascinating study, but it had always struck me as insufficient in explaining the role that Japan has played in deforesting landscapes abroad. So it was with those sorts of questions in mind that I, in graduate school, began to look at Japanese forestry practices in Korea, in the Korean peninsula. And while the book is in itself anchored to Korea, it really does try to develop a framework to understand Japanese imperial forestry practices as a whole, what I call Japan's empire of forestry in Asia. So the book uses Korea as a vantage point to kind of understand the transformation of Japan's green archipelago into an empire of forestry. And in so doing, I'm also trying to put Japan's empire in general and the Korean peninsula in particular on the map of global environmental historians. As some of you are perhaps aware, there is a growing body of literature inspired by and in conversation with Richard Grove's ideas about green imperialism, another seminal text in this regard that for decades now, scholars have been looking at the relationship between territorial expansion and conservationist thought and practice. And this is a very rich body of work, but it has always struck me as being thoroughly Eurocentric. All roads lead back to French and Germanic forestry practices. It describes a process of kind of southerly expansion into the tropics that doesn't really square with Japan's own empire. So part of what I'm trying to do in looking beyond the Green Archipelago is to map out an alternative trajectory in the growth and evolution of green imperialism in Asia, to show that Japanese colonial foresters were in conversation with their counterparts in other colonies in Europe and beyond, but they did not simply implement European or American notions of silviculture, notions of forest conservation wholesale. This was very much a negotiation, one that was rooted in this effort to tailor these concepts to the needs and biogeographical realities of the Korean peninsula and other parts of the empire. So one of the larger stakes of the project is simply putting this alternative trajectory of green imperialism in Asia on the map of global environmental historians who have been somewhat dismissive of the Japanese empire in general. I got ahead of myself a little bit. I forgot to share this slide. If ever there was sort of a expression of these kind of a triumphalist national forest culture, it can be found in Japanese bookstores. Step into any bookstore and you're likely to find shelves of books along these lines that put forward in different shapes and sizes, different approaches, some version of what I call in the book Sylvan nationalism, these sort of culturally essentialist ideas about forests and forest conservation being woven into the very DNA, the cultural fabric of what it means to be Japanese. And something similar can be said of Korea and Koreans as well. So trying to kind of sort out the intersection and entanglements of Sylvan nationalism in both countries has been one of the challenges of this research project. A second set of questions that run through the book revolve around the nature of state power. I was always struck in the course of my research, especially my archival research for this book, by the extent to which the foresters, the forestry officials and bureaucrats who populate my account, struggled to implement their agenda. They were forced back to their drawing boards. They had to regroup, rethink, re-strategize in light of geopolitical, environmental, and market constraints that were well beyond their control. And this did not square well with especially the Korean language scholarship that I had read about the Japanese colonial state, that presented it as this omnipotent, seemingly monolithic actor that simply imposed the will of officialdom from on high with kind of ruthless technocratic efficiency. And that is not at all the case when viewed from the Colonial Bureau of Forestry. These foresters struggled. They were at odds with one another as well. So contestation and negotiation of different visions for forests, productive forests and forest management is also at the heart of this book. And it often found expression in really surprising ways. I document in the book, for example, considerable evidence of internal discord within the Bureau of Forestry. These forestry experts themselves did not see eye to eye and often went to bat against one another. I found friction between the Japanese settler community and the state. So this is not just a story of Japanese rule and Korean resistance. It's a much messier reality rooted in the different interests that took shape around the management and control of woodlands in general. That's part of what has always drawn me to the study of forests, is that there's so many different things woven into one. Materially, they're sources of a wide range of natural resources. Spatially, they provide range for hunters, shade for mushrooms. They're spaces of subversion for insurgents trying to escape from the state. So for these and other reasons, forests are spaces of conflict and contestation. And that is hopefully one of the things that comes out of the book, that we can more deeply appreciate the different sorts of conflicts that all took shape over these different visions for what kind of future-minded forest conservation looked like, and the role of the state and its agents, and the limitations placed on the state and its agents in efforts to impose some form of environmental rule over a Korean peninsula that is incredibly mountainous. Here, it's worth mentioning that mountains and forests comprise well over 70% of the Korean landscape. And yet, in English language scholarship, virtually nothing has been written about them. There's very much an arable land bias that is pervasive in English language scholarship on colonial Korea. To the extent scholars have looked beyond the cities, they've looked to rice production and the countryside, but they have paid precious little attention to the mountains and watersheds that surround them. And so part of what I'm trying to do here is to center those landscapes, in part because they are so central to the Korean landmass itself. One episode, one kind of question that looms large in my account is that of Hwajon, of fire field farming, what we might call Swidden agriculture or shifting cultivation. In the eyes of the Japanese colonial state, Hwajon and Hwajonmin, the practitioners of this fire field farming, were the boogeymen of deforestation. They were the principal drivers of all of Korea's forestry problems. They were slashing and burning their way through productive forests. They lived a lifestyle that was anathema to modernity. They were unhygienic. They were also subversive. They were operating in close coordination with the guerrilla insurgents who routinely waged war against the colonial state. So from the get-go, the Japanese Bureau of Forestry launches a crusade against Hwajon and Hwajonmin, throwing tons of resources financially and in terms of manpower at the problem. This is a geographical problem as well. This practice, as the map to the left makes clear, is concentrated overwhelmingly in the more mountainous northern provinces of Korea. They work closely with security officials, military officials to sedentarize these communities, to anchor them to the land through intensive agriculture. And yet, despite all of these efforts, the problem of Hwajon persists across the colonial period. And this is, again, a portrait of a more humble colonial state than we often account in literature, that they threw all of these resources at the problem and were still unable to resolve it. And in some ways, made the problem worse through land redistribution issues, is suggestive of serious constraints on the colonial rule, the imposition of the state's will. And I think that's an important part of the story to bring forward, and especially is something that you don't often see in Korean language scholarship on the nature of ilcheha, this kind of nameless, faceless, monolithic colonial state. One of the things that further drew me to this topic was a frustration with English language scholarship on the Japanese empire, on colonial rule in Korea, but really beyond the empire as a whole, that took the material underpinnings of colonial expansion and settler colonialism for granted. There's been a considerable amount of ink spilled on the growth of the railway across the Asian continent as part of Japan's colonial expansion. This thickening cobweb of railway lines that crisscross the Korean peninsula into Manchuria and elsewhere. There is considerable attention devoted to the development of settler colonial enclaves in urban areas like Seoul, Kejo, the growth of factories from the 1930s onward that were important sites for manufacturing chemicals and later munitions during the war. These are all important kind of defining features of Japan's expansionism. And yet, in most accounts, the material underpinnings of these projects are almost summoned from thin air. And so another objective of mine with this book is to more fully appreciate the fact that all of these materials come from somewhere, that we can't understand the growth of railways and settler populations without recognizing that they were dependent on and facilitated material extraction of different sorts. That behind the flow of board feet of timber, export of charcoal and fuel wood, the telegraphs and railway sleepers that were essential to this expansionism, lay a timber industry that was a key engine in facilitating Japan's colonial expansion in Korea and beyond. So the book can also be read as my attempt to pay greater attention to what I call the materiality of modernization, to recognize that the homes that settlers lived in Seoul came from the forests of the northern provinces. This is very much a geographical story. One cannot understand where these resources are coming from without paying serious attention to the Yalu River Basin, what becomes the hub of the colonial era timber industry, where not just the state, but Japanese corporations, transnational timber companies of all sorts, set up shop and become really important actors in the extraction and circulation of forest commodities within Korea, but also crucially abroad. This is a story that extends well beyond the Korean peninsula. To understand the materiality of modernization, to understand the colonial era timber industry, we have to pay very serious attention to the commodity chains and resource flows that linked Korea to Manchuria across the Yalu River. A considerable portion of Korea's forest commodities from 1932 onwards actually flow northward out of Korea into Manchuria, where they become essential building blocks for the construction of Manchukuo, this kind of new satellite state on the Asian continent. Likewise, they're flowing back to the archipelago. It's very messy and complex, making sense of the geography of these resource flows, but it is suggestive of the sort of links that knit together the empire of forestry, that you can't just look at Korea as its own self-contained unit. You have to pay careful attention to the corporations, the commodity chains, the market dynamics that bind the Japan's empire of forestry together. So I look in a couple of different chapters, I try to bring this geography, bring these commodity chains to the fore by tracing the flow of timber from the site of felling logs on the slopes of Mount Paektu, working their way down the Yalu River, being transformed into a variety of forest products and being shipped across the peninsula and abroad. But I became most interested over the course of my research in one material in particular, and that's fuel. For those of you who have spent a winter in the Korean peninsula, you know well the importance of fuel. It is a bitterly, bone-chillingly cold place to spend a winter. So issues of access to steady supplies of fuel were not trivial matters. They were essential questions for Koreans across class, regional, occupational lines, urban and rural, Japanese or Korean. Everyone needed a steady supply of fuel, not just to enjoy their lives, but really to survive, especially in the northern provinces where winter temperatures can plunge. This was a matter of survival and health as much as it was anything else. So over the course of the book, I also try to bring to the fore the politics of home heating, the domestication of heat. And I look in particular at the ondo, the heated floor systems that are conventional to Korean architecture, to Korean dwellings, that in the eyes of the colonial state were ground zero of deforestation. They were calorically inefficient. They were drivers of waste and really important. But beyond that, they were also sites, kind of the source of lethargy for the Korean people. That if Koreans were to embrace a modern lifestyle like their Japanese colonial rulers, they needed to break free of the ondo lifestyle to live a more enterprising existence. This, again, is the patronizing rhetoric of colonialism, but very quickly home heating practices are woven into these broader discourses about the depravity and backwardness of the Korean people. It's linked to kind of this rhetoric of civilization and savagery and the civilizing mission of Japanese settler colonialism in Korea. More and more, the practice of ondo reform and living a calorically efficient lifestyle is also linked to is interpreted as an act of imperial fealty, and is seen as sort of a metric of the Japanification of the Korean spirit. Part of what draws me to this research is it provides an opportunity to really look carefully as an environmental historian, as a forest historian, not at the forests, but at the domestic sphere. We often think of forestry as being something practiced out in the mountains, out in the hinterlands. But when you start to pay attention to home heating, you recognize that it was also inextricably linked to the rhythms and routines of everyday life in the household. Much to my surprise, the forestry officials that I write about were churning out reports on Korean folk, on Korean vernacular architecture, on dietary practices, on home heating practices. They weren't trained to do any of these things, but they knew that they needed to reconfigure the Korean home and its thermodynamics if they were going to meaningfully resolve issues of kind of burning practices and their link to the forest. This is where questions of gender also enter the picture. When we pay attention to the politics of home heating, we can also recognize kind of the disproportionate burden that was placed on women and children in particular as guardians against profligacy, who oversaw the sort of rhythms and routines of forest consumption. And that's not a dimension of forest management, forest history that you often encounter in these more bureaucratic, policy-oriented studies. So I wanted to kind of collapse the boundaries between scholarship on forest policy and on everyday life to show how the two were closely interlinked. Lastly, at sort of the broadest level, the book can be read as an interpretation, and my attempt to tell a story about forest conservation cast in a darker shade of green. Reforestation, kind of the efforts towards greenification, forest regeneration are everywhere in Japanese colonial era planning documents. By the time that Japan annexes the Korean peninsula in 1910, it's routinely being described as a land of bald mountains and red earth, a denuded wasteland that the Koreans themselves had failed to conserve, failed to protect. This, of course, is hyperbolic rhetoric. It was self-serving, incredibly biased. One of the real challenges for me as a researcher was to kind of parse rhetoric from reality to get a sense of what the scope of deforestation, what it actually looked like on the ground. So in the book, I try to maintain critical distance from these sorts of exaggerated accounts, but they were not totally fantastical. There is very compelling evidence that the southern provinces of Korea were indeed heavily denuded by the end of the Chosun period, the turn of the 20th century. And so in the eyes of the colonial state, the job before them was to blanket the Korean landscape in a new layer of green through intensive silvicultural practices, projects. And this is not a part of the story of Japanese colonial forestry that you often encounter. If you were to read Korean accounts of Japanese colonial rule, you would encounter invariably accounts of ruthless extraction on the part of the colonial state that was hell-bent on sapping the forests for whatever resources they offered and little else. That may have been true of the wartime mobilization of Korean forests that I talk about in the final chapter of the book, but it was well before the mobilization of forests for war. There was this very concerted effort on the part of the colonial state to plant trees. This was out of utilitarian concerns for flood control, flood management, but they also recognized kind of how it softened the image of colonial rule. It projected a colonial state that was invested in, that was future-minded, that had a green thumb, that was lifting up the Korean landscape and with it the Korean people. And so while that's the rhetoric of the colonial state itself, I show in this book that these projects of reforestation were simultaneously efforts at social control. That when we look more carefully at and critically at how reforestation worked on the ground, we begin to recognize that it is in and of itself a vector of coercive force. And as such, we need to think much more critically about the rhetoric of greenification more generally. We tend to think of the greening of landscapes as being singularly good things, benevolent acts in the interests of future generations. That may be true, but when you look at the mechanics of them on the ground, they often reveal deeply inequitable policies. There are winners and losers in these projects of greenification. And the case of colonial Korea, I think, reveals them in spades, those sorts of power dynamics and coercive dynamics that are inherent in these larger projects of greenification. And I say this as the leaders of the world, fresh out of COP26, have announced to much fanfare the end of deforestation. Just last year, there were headline after headline suggesting that through mass campaigns of tree planting, that the global community could bring deforestation to an end by 2040. I'll believe it when I see it, but to me, having finished this book somewhat recently, it's also a call to think much more carefully about what's being planted where and to whose benefit. That these calls for mass reforestation are great and are absolutely important measures against mitigating against anthropogenic climate change, but we also need to pause and think about the broader politics of what these projects look like on the ground and their impacts on local communities, human and animal both. The last thing I'm going to simply mention is that this colonial project has legacies that extend well beyond 1945. If we are to understand the greening of Korea under Park Chung-hee, the so-called forest miracle of the 1960s and 70s under Park's developmental dictatorship, we have to look carefully at linkages to colonial era policies. This isn't to suggest that South Korea is heavily forested because of colonial rule, but it is a call to think more carefully about how the forestry agenda developed by the colonial state goes on to inform the policies and approaches to greenification and social control that were defining features of Park's own unique brand of authoritarianism. So there are legacies of different sorts, both in Korea, but also in the Japanese empire as we see it today in Southeast Asia. So while the collapse of the Japanese empire in August of 1945 brought an end to this colonial era forestry project, it quickly reinvented itself and reemerged from the 1950s onward in the tropical forests of Southeast Asia, where Japanese corporations and their proxies have moved often in very subtle ways. You would never know, looking at the shareholding agreements, the kind of different corporate structures involved, that Japan is at the helm of this process, but they have funneled tropical timbers into Japan for plywood production, among other things, at really staggering rates. So this is suggestive to me of the reemergence of Japan's empire of forestry, something that remains alive and well into the present day. I'm going to stop there. I really do look forward to your comments and questions, and I'm especially eager to hear from Renata and thankful for her taking the time to read the book beforehand.
Thank you for your presentation, David. It has been also interesting to rethink some points I catch from the book. And the first thing I would like to say, absolutely love the title, because it is bearing so many different connotations, and actually reminds us how easy it is to control another human being, and to control also environment when we are actually not entitled for that. And I'm sorry for political manifest, which is Ukrainian flag behind me, but I think it's very important to keep Ukraine in focus every single minute, because this is actually in the subject. It's also about colonization, and this is why. So if someone feels offended, I apologize. But I may say that I am so far from you disciplinary and also geographically with my research. So the closest place I've been is Tajikistan, where we studied Yanobi minorities adaptation after relocation, forced relocation, again, an expression of colonialism, Russian colonialism in this context. But I'm really thankful to Marco for assigning me this task, because there have been too many things that triggered my attention, and which I could connect with the area which I study, which is former Soviet Union and its borders, and ethnic and linguistic minorities on that border. And going to the disciplinary differences, as I'm coming from semiotics from my background, but also from folklore. All my study is based on people. So, of course, I consult historical documents if I feel it's needed, or if it's going along with my study. But main resource I'm using are people. So my question to you, I understand the time is very far away in a way, but the descendants of the people who live this time are still living, and they still may have the historical memories of what their family went through, and it's definitely kept in the family narratives. What do you think? Would this add something to your research? And if, then what it could be?
Sorry, I was just writing that down. Most certainly it would add something to the research. It's not something I made kind of central to my research project. I was much more invested in getting into archives and working through documents. That's not to say that I didn't talk to people to get a sense of their own experiences, but that's not something that I kind of systematically worked into my study or my research methodology. Regrettably, I think if I had the time and the foresight to kind of try to track that down and take their accounts more seriously and incorporate them into the research, it would have added all sorts of really interesting textures about everyday life that I think are really important and are often sidelined in forest history. I think, for example, I have a chapter in the book about fuel scarcity, the bodily, corporeal experience of what it's like to not have enough fuel during wartime in Korea, and how for ordinary Koreans, that's part of the defining that's what defines everyday life under total war conditions. Just being cold, shivering, being uncomfortable in that regard. If I had more, I imagine that if I were to seek out these sorts of stories, these oral history traditions, done more ethnographic research along these lines, I would have picked up lots of family lore about that sort of thing that is very scarcely reflected in the archive. Here it's worth noting that a lot of the archival research I'm working in a colonial archive that's an analytical minefield. I tried to the best of my ability in my presentation today, but especially in the book, to interrogate the biases of the archive, to recognize how self-serving it can be, especially documents produced by the colonial state. But I think if I had spoken with people and done more of what you are suggesting, I would have been in a significantly better position to critique the colonial state by amplifying the voices of people who were pushed to the margins of the colonial archive itself. Here too, I wonder, excuse me, if I wouldn't have been able to paint a more vivid portrait of the Huazhong Min, the firefield farmers, communities that were targeted, kind of, as I mentioned, that were labeled as the drivers of deforestation, but about whom we know almost nothing. They were some of the poorest residents of the Korean people, the Korean peninsula. They were pushed into this lifestyle out of desperation. They were pushed off the land and tried to eke out an existence deep by tilling the land on deep in the mountains. Who were they? What were their family structures like? What drove them into these dire straits? The documents that I looked at didn't tell me much of anything, but I imagine if I had more time to talk to individuals and kind of capture these more informal channels of storytelling, I would have learned a lot more about those sorts of communities.
Thank you, David. So we can wait for the volume 2 or the chapter 2.
Yeah, well, I suppose.
It would be very nice, because the second question I actually wanted to ask you about this credibility of colonial history or colonial descriptions of the situation, and also of from the respects of caloric overuse by the traditional style of heating, because this is the opinion of colonial state. Certainly were mechanisms that were controlling the expenditure of energy and the availability of the wood for that. So, and also from that perspective, I just recall from my own studies, or even from my own common knowledge as Estonian, where what was written in the papers was very far from what it was real. So the common anecdote was that the pig had 3 piglets, but when the information reached Moscow, 3 became 15. So this was a common way of presenting results in planned economy. And also, for example, why Estonia had so much forest when the Soviet Union collapsed. It was simply because Estonians were clever buying the forest from Siberia and selling it or presenting it as Estonian timber to the colonizers. So there were tricks for survival. I'm absolutely not aware of how those tricks were working in Korea, but they definitely were. So And you actually did very well paying attention to this, but just an example from different society, from different colonialism.
The second chapter of the book is really my attempt to read against the grain, archivally speaking, to kind of point out exactly what you just pointed out in the Soviet context, that these descriptions of the landscape are hyperbolic, problematic on so many different levels. But it's tricky. I mean, this really was for me one of the fundamental challenges of conducting this research, because as I mentioned, there's also ample evidence of severe deforestation. And so what I'm trying to do in that chapter is to bring all of the evidence together to read these over-the-top accounts of colonial administrators against photographs that we have of the landscape, against soil reports, against data on market transactions, forest commodities that very clearly show a spike over the course of the 19th century in the cost of wood, timber, other forest products that is strongly suggestive of scarcity. And so, I mean, I'll leave it to the reader to decide how compelling this exercise is. But I am very sensitive in the book to those sorts of power dynamics, to the kind of propagandistic role that these descriptions play, and the vested interest of the colonial state in kind of promoting its own agenda and legitimacy. I do take that very seriously. And I think one of the best examples of this, I don't actually fully develop in the book itself. It's actually something that I spell out in much more detail in an article I published in 2018 in the Journal of Korean Studies on the ondol. I mentioned this kind of home heating system that was marked as ground zero of deforestation. The Japanese, over the course of the 1910s and 20s, produced report after report after report about how they're going to reform not just the ondol, but the ondol lifestyle that became a marker of the sloth of the Korean people, the torpor of the Korean people, their poor hygienic practices. Well, at the same time that Japanese foresters and officials and critics of the ondol are writing these reports, they themselves are using the ondol. Across the whole colonial period, they continue to be entirely dependent on this technology. And to me, it just threw into very sharp focus the hypocrisy that while they were quick to kind of subordinate the Korean people and this technology, they also recognize its incredible utility. It was the best tool available to them in this context that was significantly colder, mind you, than back in Japan. And that to me was just, I think, really crystallized some of the limitations of colonial rule, but also how problematic this rhetoric of the thermodynamic inefficiency, the caloric problems of the Korean people are, that the Japanese foresters tasked with addressing these problems didn't jettison this technology, that continued to use it, I think tells you all that you need to know about the nature of that rhetoric.
Exactly. But thank you very much. I see we are running out of time. I have a few more examples, but I think this is not that important. Now the audience certainly has.
You can take some time. I mean, just for one last question, one or a couple of last questions. You go for it, Renata. Don't worry.
They are more remarks, not the questions, in sense that for me it's the parallel between this kind of inviting body and mind through the forestation, or through the, as you say, seeds of control, is sounding really important bell, because when we speak about the heating, it's a security question. When we speak about food, it is also a security question. Soviet Union acted, well, it was not really able to take out the heating unless they destroyed the houses, but they took out food. And the Holodomor in 1930s, the extreme hunger, which was artificially made in 1930s in Ukraine, in Belarus, and those in some Russian regions, in order for people to join the collective farms, was acting exactly in the same manner as during the war in Korea. So, because they, it's exactly the way of controlling. When I was getting my ERC and having interview, well, I was not yet aware that I'm getting it. And this started a discussion around how much they actually intervened into the households. And if they actually affected the way of people lived. And then at that moment, I thought, okay, maybe it was not that bad. They didn't control what you put in your mouth or how you do your food. But now, 5 years, 4.5 after the project have been in place, I can say, actually, yes, they did intervene, maybe not directly, not standing close to the oven, but they did change the diet. They did change the way people perceived the wild plants, and they did change the way people approach the food subject as such. And this is quite crucial in colonization, that this is exactly the way of controlling, as a way of perceiving another human beings less than yourself. And this is probably the base for it. And actually, a few days ago, I was thinking maybe I can ask you this question because I don't have yet an answer for that. But looking at what is going on in Ukraine, I've been thinking that, well, we have failed as humanity. And this is not the only war which is going around at such a scale, with such a brutality, just because some people think that they are better than others. What do you think, as a historian, is there a chance for us to change this kind of attitude? Because this is also the base of our environmental crisis, because we think that the environment is less than us. Okay, we are destroying it just in order to feel temporarily a bit better. Do you think we have a chance?
Now that is a hell of a question. I do. I have 3 little daughters at home, so my mind is always on the next generation and the horizon. Lord, if we don't get our act together soon, we don't. That much I am sure of. And I still think best case scenario, it's still a matter of living a diminished quality of life at this point. Now, to your questions of our shared humanity, the drivers of it. I shared this kind of instinctual linkage between the failure of the imagination that has led to, and sense of humanity that has led to this terrible war, and some of the systemic problems involved in the degradation of environments across the globe. I don't think it's difficult to draw those out. Part of it is the question of structural responsibility. Part of it is, but as I think you're suggesting, that there's something kind of that's been lost at the level of emotional connection, and that is hugely important. I see it at work in the context of the Japanese colonial empire as well. One of the things that's so interesting to me about, and so upsetting to me about writing about the wartime in colonial Korea, is they are simultaneously, I wonder if you see linkages here with Russian-Ukrainian ties, they're simultaneously invoking kind of pan-Asian solidarity, that they are brothers, and that they are conserving Korea, they're mobilizing Korea's forests for a fight against the West to preserve Asia for Asians, and that Japan and Korea are linked. They're united as one. So it's kind of cloaked in the rhetoric of pan-Asian solidarity, and yet in the next breath, the Japanese are playing up their cultural and ethnic superiority. That they sit atop the hierarchy of the Asian people. They are going to lead Asia in the creation of this co-prosperity sphere. And so this rhetoric is shot through with contradiction, but also, as you're pointing out, for one reason or another, this sense of superiority, supremacy, that the Japanese hold toward their colonial subjects, even though they're told that if the Korean people plant enough trees and conserve enough fuel, their spirit is going to become aligned with and rise to the level of their Japanese rulers. That could never be the case. They are marked. They are culturally inferior, ethnically inferior, precisely because of their Koreanness, and those sort of bigoted attitudes are very much laced into the rhetoric and policies of forest management in Korea as well. So I don't know that this addresses your question head on, but it's certainly a question worth thinking further about.
It's exactly the same pattern. Absolutely the same pattern in this war as well. So nothing has changed in a way. This is why I'm kind of feeling hopelessness. Sometimes I allow myself to go
I'm
down.
right there with you, Renata. I'm right there with you.
So, but I think we need to work on changing this narrative that someone can be less than you. There is no
well,
right.
This cuts to questions of environmental justice that, fortunately, where I do have hope is that the scholarly community is very much alive to the need to take very seriously these sorts of questions. Whether or not that can actually affect policy change is a whole nother question or set of questions. But I do think that centering issues of justice in scholarship on the environment is so crucial moving forward. It's something that I recognize just in the last year or two, I've come to recognizing as being vital to the field in my own scholarship in ways that I never would have recognized even just a few years prior. And that's what's at stake as much as anything else, is making sure that as we set out to address these environmental crises, we do so with an eye toward justice and equity and our shared humanity. Of course, that's easier said than done, and most people probably don't care to spend time thinking along those lines, which is why it's all the more important that we as scholars make that a public conversation, and in our own work, do whatever we can to be public facing in developing our research and scholarship, so that it can actually change the attitudes and prejudices of people that would be quick to dismiss dry scholarly analysis otherwise. So
maybe we need to take responsibility also to intervene in the policy, not as politicians, but being able And here we should speak about meta languages, be able also to speak in a language which politicians understand. And one of it is how people react on what they do. Because now we can also see from Ukrainian example how Europe is united thanks to people first who have been on the streets, who have been demanding to support Ukraine. And this is also shown by Eurovision vote, even though it's an event, not political. In a way, it became political because of people's will. So people have power, but scientists are living, I have Copamia too, are living in kind of tower, and the message is not getting there.
Yeah. Well, here
I
in the
think
United
we have
States,
much work to do this, right?
Oh, well, ain't that the truth? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we have still much to do in this regard, I guess. And I think we will, end up in a conversation like for ages on this point. But
let's go ahead.
But thanks for these. I mean, thanks for the thoughts. I fully agree with both David and Renata on especially on the role that we might have. And in fact, Maddalena and I tried to put the environmental justice as well into this kind of environmental history lectures and conferences that we had. Especially because, as David might know, coming from Japanese studies, we are often exposed to this kind of rhetoric about a nature-loving Japan, right? And I think David also mentions this point in his book, and that has been always, in harmony with the nature and so on and so forth. But in fact, and David tells us very clearly, this has not been the case, especially from the early 20th century and, with the connections to nowadays as well. So I would, if I would take some questions from the audience, if somebody has to, wants to intervene, please. Judith, I'm seeing the first hand raised, so please take it away. Hi.
Hi, I'm Judith from Zurich, and I have two short questions. One is, so I really liked your talk. It was greatly interesting. One is you presented these Huajian groups who do Sweden culture, and it seemed like it was, so the processes are turning commons into enclosured land, I guess. And so it seemed like it's only about managing colonial subjects. And I come from this group about commodity frontiers, global capitalism. And I just wanted to know if it's also, if there were capitalist interests apart from social control and managing these people. Maybe you're not, maybe.
Oh, yeah.
So I really would be interested what kind of enterprises were into timber and forestry. And the second short question is, so in Switzerland, there's now a big action about eradicating invasive species and also Japanese plants. And I just wondered, what did the Japanese plant? And was there a dichotomy between native and foreign? Or is Korea just too close to Japan to distinguish Japanese from Korean territories and so on? So what did they plant when they did forestation? Thanks.
Well, Judith, those are both excellent questions. The shortest possible answer is read the book, because I address both of them in real depth. They're crucially important topics to the study itself. I don't know that I have time to really do them justice right now, but to just give you a teaser of sorts to your first question, it is absolutely a story of state enclosure. The colonial state against the backdrop of all of this is a woodland survey. launched almost immediately upon the annexation of Korea that is geared toward kind of redrawing the maps, the titles to woodland ownership. And most of it is geared in service of enclosing newly designated state or national forests, but also doling out, creating a reforestation regime, outsourcing the heavy lifting of reforestation to Japanese corporations and capitalists. So part of why this rhetoric of deforestation is so important is that it becomes the grounds on which the colonial state siphons off supposedly degraded woodland to Japanese corporations that then oversee the process of forest generation, and upon meeting the standards of the state, receive title to the land itself. So it's this kind of clever mechanism for drawing a wedge between previous common lands that had been subject to kind of traditional land use patterns by Korean communities and the state itself. So this is a real engine of kind of redistributing land towards Japanese corporations, capitalists, settlers, among others. And so part of what drives these Hwajeonmin, these slash and burners or Swidden agriculturalists, up the mountainside into these remote, inaccessible areas is simply because they've been pushed off the land by this process. They have nowhere else to go. And they're all, as they move further north, deeper into the mountains, they're also moving deeper into newly designated national forests that are the hub, as I mentioned, of the colonial era timber industry. And this is where the capitalists really come into play. At the same time that they are enclosing these forests, they're leasing them out to Japanese transnational timber companies. These are the big kind of subsidiaries of the big conglomerates, Mitsui, Sumitomo. They all have a presence on the Korean peninsula. But the one that I have become most fascinated with, and the one that is now the subject of my new book project, is the Oji Paper Company. Oji is historically the largest corporate consumer of Asia's forests, period. Prior to 1945, it had 40 pulp and paper manufacturing plants across the Japanese empire. Today, it operates 220 plants across the Asia Pacific. And so the book I'm working on now is using Oji as a lens into the material underpinnings of Japan's print and paper culture, but also to understand kind of the role that private industry played in kind of advancing the reach of this empire of forestry. And what's interesting about Hwajeon is, one of the things that's interesting about Hwajeon is that they, the colonial state is its forestry service is relatively weak. They don't have a huge staff. The staff that they do, the forest rangers that are deputized, are tasked with policing these huge tracts of remote wilderness that they can't possibly impose their will on. So what do? They turn to private industry to help secure these porous woodland mountainous areas. And Oji Paper, Mitsui Paper, Sumitomo Forestry, they all develop their own self-defense forces, their own security apparatus that works hand in glove with the colonial state to police these porous hinterland areas. This is also the location of the guerrilla insurgency that is waged against the colonial state. Some of you are perhaps familiar with Kim Il-sung, the founding patriarch of North Korea, whose own credibility stemmed after 1945, in part from his credentials fighting against the Japanese colonial state. Well, he staged that insurgency from these national forests in the north. He was precisely the sort of person that these corporations were battling against. And he worked closely they kind of melted into these communities of Swidden agriculturalists. So there's a much larger story to be told in that regard. But to my mind, it's that's where the role of these large transnational corporations really comes most clearly into view. To your second question about invasive species, about introducing different types of trees and plant life, I dedicate a chapter to exactly this question. And I open the book with a vignette of ongoing efforts to cleanse the Korean landscape of what many Koreans today see as a legacy, a material vestige of colonial rule, which is sawtooth oak. False acacia is pervasive in Korea today, and many Koreans see it as a kind of lingering invasion of Japan's invasion of Korean soil. That's just one of a wide range of trees that are introduced by colonial foresters. I have in the book a chapter centered on colonial era scientific research, scientific forestry stations, basically the laboratories that the colonial state built in Korea to figure out what to plant where and how to plant it. And it's a much more complicated story than one might think. Early on in colonial rule, the Japanese were kind of out of a false confidence, intent on transplanting the best flora of the Japanese archipelago onto peninsular soil, sort of assuming that, well, the Japanese landscape is hardier, it's verdant, even though it wasn't really. Deforestation was pervasive there too. So we're going to take, again, out of this kind of sense of Sylvan nationalism, we're going to take our own flora and use it to lift up the Korea's own forests. They quickly realized that is not going to work. And so what I chart out, what I look at in these forest laboratories and research stations is this ongoing effort to figure out different methods, different approaches that can kind of tailor reforestation policies to the variegated climate of Korea. What you can plant in the north is not what you can plant in the south. So there is a remarkable sensitivity to the ecology of the Korean peninsula that kind of cuts against the grain of this chauvinism that defines so many other aspects of forestry policy. But I would point you to chapter 4 of the book for a much more careful look at that question.
Thank you so much. I ordered it at the library, but I still didn't receive it. So I'm looking for.
Okay, well, feel free to follow up if you have any other thoughts or questions.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Judith, for your question. If there are other questions in the chat, I'll take the chance to say goodbye to Maddalena that has to leave soon, maybe, or. Thanks again.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. I learned a lot on a topic on which I hardly know anything. So it was really, really informative.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
We actually had one lecture before on the weaponization, basically, of forests, and now we have forests as a way, and I think this has come to the fore, through discussion and through also Renata's inputs very well and very clear also to the fore in this occasion. The forest is used as a means of social control, right? So yeah. This I think it's a great point, and something that we might be able to include also in our classes, in our lectures when we introduce histories of China and Japan as well to our students. So this also, might go back to one of the points that were raised by Renata's discussion as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I had a small question, but as the building is closing soon, I might be not
able to hear
to
the response.
Get out of here. Yeah.
I'm really sorry, but it was really great. And please go on with the discussion.
Yeah, well, thank you very much.
Thanks,
Bye.
Maddalena.
See you soon.
I mean, I was just, rethinking of while waiting if there are other questions. Just I will throw some thoughts and maybe some comments at David, and also at what Renata also commented upon, which your presentation as well, David, reminded me of things that I read on James Scott's Seeing Like a State, and all these his research upon state evasion, basically, and when you mentioned the firefield farmers and all this, and also the tricks that Renata mentioned of evading state control, and especially when it's all states are in certain regions, especially in Asia, might be considered foreigners, or in a way. In this case, we have this double this distance. Probably these people were already chased after by the Korean states, whichever it was in Joseon period, and so on and so forth, and then they had to try and negotiate their relations with the Japanese colonial administration. So I was wondering, what did you find more interesting about this kind of attempt to evade, attempt to escape from the state, and so on and so forth in the Korean setting?
I would say what's most interesting to me about this question is the pervasiveness, the continuity of the practice of Hwajeon. So if you go back and you look at Joseon period documents, go look at the annals of the Joseon dynasty, the kind of dynastic chronicle of the front that goes back to the 14th century, you're going to see a persistent concern with this practice of Hwajeon that carries through across the Joseon period. It then becomes channeled into colonial era documents who share a similar concern, and in ways that I just described, set out to stamp out the practice of Hwajeon and largely fail to do so. It's not until the 1970s that there is any real meaningful progress in bringing the practice of Hwajeon to an end, and that is only really because Park Chung-hee, the ruler of South Korea, the president of South Korea, mobilizes the military to wage a war against Hwajeon, and in many ways kind of implements the policies that the colonial state had tried and failed to do a couple of decades prior. So there's something really compelling to me about the ability of these communities to kind of melt into the mountains, to defy the master plans of the state. But it's also a testament, I think, to the militarization of South Korea under Park Chung-hee, that he eventually, through kind of sheer muscle and might and determination, was able to meaningfully address the issue. It's also worth noting that this is after the division of the peninsula. This is after the Korean War has been waged. This is a time when national security concerns are all important. Concerns of kind of fears of communism are pervasive in South Korea. And so that, I think that kind of changes the paradigm, changes the framework in which Pak is able to look at the problem and address it. The book doesn't say as much as I would like it to about the environmental legacies of the Korean War. Hugely destructive. I mean, World War II was terrible for Korea's forests in terms of mobilization. The Korean War was terrible for Korea's forests precisely because it was the battle space itself. I mean, this is where the war was waged in and around the Korean landscape. So absolutely devastating for the environment, for the Korean people, just in terms of lives lost as well. So there's a lot more that can and should be said about how the division of the peninsula changes forestry practices, changes the relationship between North and South. I see Roger Macy pointing out that Pak was an officer in the Imperial Japanese Army. Absolutely. I mean, that's more or less the argument I make in my book, is that Pak was, and here I'm echoing Carter Eckert, who's written this kind of magisterial biography of Pak Chung-hee, that Pak inherited the disciplinary framework and approach of the colonial state. He fine-tunes it, he changes it, but he recognizes the importance of kind of militarizing approaches to governance, and he doesn't hesitate to lean on the military to address his own kind of efforts to govern the forests, to govern the environment more generally. I suppose I'll tack on here a note that this is also when Korea's environmentalist movement also begins to take shape, tied to kind of anti-authoritarian activism, the making of Minjung, and efforts after the death of Pak Chung-hee to kind of reclaim the environment. Yes, industrialization was a marker of progress under Pak's rule, but it was also a source of incredible toxicity and pollution. And from the 1980s onwards, the South Korean people really began to launch a full-fledged environmental movement geared toward addressing these issues with industrial pollution and so forth.
Thanks a lot, David. And no other questions from the audience? Well, let's wait another couple of minutes. And something that also came to my mind, was all the discussion about, the attempt to simplify. And this also goes back to one of Renata's probably object of research, actually, the changing relation with wild species, right? With wild plants, while getting accustomed to, kind of a standardized sets of plants that happen too, right? In Korea as well, with Japanese imperialism.
Yeah.
Did I get it right?
You did. And here's where I'm going to plug the work of one of my dear friends and colleagues, John Lee, he's at Durham University. And he's writing a book just about Chosun era forestry that's called Kingdom of the Pines. And one of the things that he shows is that the Chosun state was obsessively interested and focused on planting one tree, Pinus densiflora, the red pine, and which dominated the Korean landscape over the course of the Chosun dynasty. It was a serviceable conifer, which is part of its appeal to the state, but it also meant that there were extensive monocultures across the Korean landscape. You don't necessarily want one tree to dominate your forest ecology. It exposes it to blight and other problems. And that was one of the drivers of kind of Joseon era forestry problems. One of the goals then of the colonial state was to try to diversify the landscape. They recognized that red pine was everywhere, and that in the interest of resilience, they needed to introduce other sorts of tree species. That's not to say that they wanted a wild landscape at all. They were doing more or less what you described. They wanted something that was predictable, that was kind of stamped in the mold of their managerial approaches, and something that furnished the sorts of forest commodities that they prioritized, namely charcoal. One of the biggest planting initiatives, well, there are two: erosion control, things that had hardy root systems that would help address perennial issues with flooding and flood control, and trees that would furnish fuel wood and charcoal to help address issues in fuel scarcity. So it was those sorts of trees that they tried to plant in really vast quantities, but to do so in a way that, following James Scott and Seeing Like a State, would have been legible and something that they could manage through a system of sustainable yield forestry.
Thanks a lot. Please, Roger.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. I should look forward to reading the book very much. And I've got a completely unrelated point about OG paper, which I'll email you about.
Please.
And one reason I've been reluctant to speak is I had to miss a bit in the middle. But you might have covered this. But is anybody particularly comparing the situation with particularly Taiwan?
I don't really compare in the book what's going on in Korea with Taiwan so much as show the connective tissues. So a lot of the forestry bureaucrats and officials who are at the helm of reforms in Korea cut their teeth in Taiwan. They're sent there shortly after 1895 to administer this newly acquired colonial territory. They spend a few years there before they're circulated out to Hokkaido or elsewhere in the Japanese Empire. I'm really struck by this kind of network of professional foresters, almost all of them holding degrees from the Nogakubu, the Department of Agriculture at Tokyo Imperial University, who are kind of channeled into the newly established Bureau of Forestry, and then they each do a stint in a different part of the empire. And Taiwan is one of the first places that most of them go. And it is formative in shaping their views on colonial forestry practices. For example, one of the defining experiences of these foresters in Taiwan is conflict in the mountains with indigenous communities there. It is lethal to conduct forest surveys deep in the mountains of Taiwan. The surveying parties are routinely accosted and sometimes end up in gun battles. And that kind of imprints, leaves a deep impression on a lot of these foresters that mountains and forests in colonial territories are deeply subversive and dangerous spaces. And it's no accident that from 1910 onwards in Korea, every surveyor is required to have military escort. So those sorts of experiences and kind of trans-imperial networks, I think, are really interesting and important in trying to understand kind of what knit what I call the empire of forestry together. So while I don't write at length about Taiwan, I do recognize how important it was as kind of a laboratory for shaping approaches to colonial forestry.
Yes, that's interesting. And I would imagine there is actually a difference in the post-colonial viewpoint. I mean, going to Taipei, was the National Museum, and there's rooms, tributing to the Japanese pioneers. I'm only talking about 2 years ago, and I can't imagine the same being the case in Seoul.
No, you will not see any celebration of colonial forestry anywhere in either Korea. You will see accounts of forest ruination and nothing else. And so, it's always so striking the divergence there. But that's something I hope to look at a little bit more. There's some great scholarship. Kwang Chi-hung he's a geographer at Taiwan National University, but he publishes he's doing great English language scholarship on forestry in Taiwan that I would point you to as kind of the best, most cutting edge research being done in that field right now. Email me and I'm happy to send you a reference.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Roger. I don't see any other questions, and I will slowly move towards the conclusion of this lecture, if everybody agrees. If Renata maybe has one last comment. I mean, it's personally, let me just express my gratitude to Renata as well, because when we first planned this event with David, we weren't in the midst of a war, actually. So, you know, many of the topics that were raised today, I think kind of speak to our, you know, reality and like very recent events.
Yeah.
And, you know, the need for, you know, more discussion on topics that are somehow related to what it's happening, even though probably not presented as such, but definitely, you know, environmental justice and the control of environmental resources are key to understanding, I guess, every single conflict that is going on and will probably erupt in the coming years. I don't know if David and Renata agree to what I just said, but I was very happy to, you know, kind of, you know, make our event today, you know, speak also to the present and to the very recent event. So if you have any last comments or any last words.
Thank you, Marco, first of all, for getting me here in this environment, and thank you, David, for introducing me to your book, not only now, but by the chance to read it. Otherwise, I wouldn't probably read it because forestry is not my field exactly, nor Korea, nor Japan. But one thing maybe to think about, or what was sounding for me now in current conversation, was the perception of forest, or kind of parallel between forest and wilderness, which is not that univocal, because wild can be also close to the house and not in the forest. And maybe I can just bring an example of Heracleum Sosnowski, which as acacia, and this was a very first striking example which I got from your book, as acacia was introduced to the region, especially to the Baltics. And this is kind of, it was introduced as fodder for the good intent, but it was engineered species, which now has become invasive. And Estonia, it's still kind of under control because millions are spent for that. But in Latvia and in Russia and Belarus, it's absolutely out of control. And there is no chance that this will get out of the landscape. So also in this domain, not only forest, but the rest of the landscape, where the trees are not growing, it's also a domain which is influenced by colonialism. So
I'll have to look into that. It sounds awfully familiar, parallel to what I chart out in the book.
And well, given that it was introduced in purpose.
Yeah. Great.
David,
okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Renata,
Thank you.
Please go ahead. Okay.
I finished.
Okay, cool. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. David, do you have any last
I just want
comments?
to express my gratitude once again.
Okay.
Thank you for having me. It's a delight to get to connect with people in Italy. I don't know when I'll be able to be there in person, but I would absolutely be thrilled to have a chance for our paths to cross down the road. I have in the chat box, I've put my email address. I invite you all to reach out if you have any other questions or want to follow up about anything. I'm always happy to have a conversation that way. And thank you again to Marco and Renata, especially for taking the time to make this happen.
I would thank you too, David. Thanks so much. You've been very kind and so available, actually. So thanks a lot. And we're of course looking forward to having you one day.
Yeah. Well, let's keep talking,
in
Marco.
Venice. Let's keep talking about that. And if not in person, at least with another
that works
online
too.
lecture.
Yep. Cool. All right, everyone. Take care.
Thanks a lot to everybody and see you soon. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.